An arrogant passenger mocked an older man, until he realized it was Clint Eastwood. You won't believe how it ended. The boarding gate buzzed with the quiet chaos of an early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. Passengers moved, forward in orderly lines, gripping coffee cups and carry-ons, their expressions a blend of exhaustion and determination. This was the first-class boarding group, an air of exclusivity hanging over them, subdued yet unmistakable. Among them stood a man who drew attention, not just for his crisp navy suit or the gleaming leather shoes that caught the terminal lights, but for the way he carried himself, exuding an unshakable sense of superiority. In his mid-40s, he had the demeanor of someone who'd spent years conquering boardrooms, collecting achievements, and never questioning his place at the top. He wasn't just flying, he was making a statement, even among strangers. As he strode toward the gate, his briefcase swinging in sync with his steps, his gaze swept over the other passengers with barely concealed indifference. Soon he was settled in his first-class seat, scrolling through emails as others filed in. Then he noticed him. An older man shuffled down the aisle, carrying only a small bag. He wasn't dressed for first class, at least not by the businessman's standards. A tan jacket, plaid shirt, and worn loafers completed his understated look. His face, weathered by time, held a quiet serenity, as if life had long since stripped him of the need to impress. The older man moved without fanfare, settling into his seat, adjusting his jacket, and tucking his bag away before leaning back to gaze out the window. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, humble, unassuming. But to the businessman, he was an oddity. With a sly grin, the younger man leaned just close enough for the older man to hear. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he remarked, smirking. A few heads turned, passengers catching the edge in his tone. The older man didn't flinch. He glanced at the businessman briefly, the ghost of a smile touching. His lips then returned to the window. The silence irritated the businessman. Undeterred, he pressed on, his voice sharper now. "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" The condescension was thick, yet the older man refused to bite. He merely adjusted his seatbelt and kept his eyes on the tarmac. His calm was louder than any retort, and it only stoked the businessman's arrogance. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, the businessman leaned back, smug. But something nagged at him. The older man's composure wasn't just silence, it was certainty, an unshakable confidence that felt out of place in a world obsessed with appearances. The plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settling into the familiar hum of travel. Yet the businessman couldn't let it go. The older man's refusal to engage felt like a challenge. Crossing his legs, he leaned into the aisle and smirked. "I'm curious," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days, when planes ran on propellers?" A few uneasy glances were exchanged, but no one spoke up. The older man took a slow breath, then turned slightly. For a moment, their eyes met, his gaze, steady, unreadable, as if weighing the younger man's intent. Then, without a word, he looked back out the window. The businessman scoffed, reclining in his seat. "Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." The businessman chuckled, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. To him, the silence was surrender, proof he'd won some imaginary battle. The older man didn't react. He simply folded his hands in his lap and adjusted the cuff of his tan jacket, a small, deliberate motion that screamed, "You're not worth my time." Nearby passengers grew uneasy. A woman in her 50s shot the businessman a withering glare. A young couple exchanged hushed whispers, their eyes flicking toward the older man. The air in the cabin tightened, thick with second-hand discomfort. Yet no one intervened. Oblivious, the businessman turned to another suited passenger across the aisle, jerking his thumb toward the older man. "You know, people love to romanticize the past, but no phones, no tech. How did they even function?" The other man offered a strained laugh, clearly unwilling to engage. Unfazed, the businessman barreled on. Nostalgia's a lie. The world's better now, whether they admit it or not. Then the flight attendant arrived with the beverage cart, her smile polished but tight. She paused at the older man's row and bent slightly. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, warmth and deference in her voice. "Coffee or tea?" The businessman froze. His tablet slid from his grip. Eastwood. The name struck him like a thunderclap. His stomach dropped as the pieces snapped together. The calm demeanor, the weathered face, the quiet authority. The older man turned. "Coffee, black, please," he replied, his voice steady. Clint Eastwood. The legend himself. The man whose films defined generations, whose presence commanded respect without effort. And here he sat, enduring petty jabs from a stranger who hadn't even recognized him. A murmur rippled through the cabin. "Is that—" "It's him, I swear." "Clint Eastwood?" The businessman's face drained of color. His earlier words played back in his mind, each one a fresh humiliation. He'd mocked an icon to his face, treated him like some relic, when in truth, he was the one who'd looked foolish all along. He gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. How could I not have seen it? Then, with a dry swallow, he leaned forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood." His voice was meek now, a far cry from his earlier bravado. Eastwood turned. His gaze wasn't angry, but it wasn't forgiving either. It was the look of a man who'd faced down outlaws' wars and Hollywood egos, a look that said, "I've dealt with worse than you." "Yes?" The businessman opened his mouth. No words came. What was he supposed to say? Sorry for being an ass? Sorry I didn't recognize you? Sorry I treated you like you didn't belong here? Every apology felt hollow. I didn't realize," he stammered, the words crumbling under Eastwood's steady gaze. The older man raised an eyebrow. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "I didn't mean to offend you," the businessman whispered. I didn't know who you were." For the first time, amusement flickered across Eastwood's face. He set his coffee down with deliberate calm. "And if I wasn't who you think I am?" His voice was quiet, razor sharp. "What? If I were just some nobody in a plaid shirt," Eastwood continued, "would that make how you spoke to me acceptable?" The businessman's mouth opened. Closed. The question landed like a gut punch. Around them, the cabin hushed, even the flight. Attendants paused, their eyes darting toward the confrontation. "I guess not," he admitted, cheeks burning. Eastwood gave a barely perceptible nod. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back to the window. Conversation over. But for the businessman, the reckoning had just begun. Eastwood's lesson, delivered without raised voices or theatrics, hung in the air, inescapable. The arrogance he'd worn like armor now felt like a lead weight. He wanted to apologize again, to explain, but the words withered under the truth. He hadn't just insulted a legend. He'd revealed himself. After an eternity, he leaned forward, voice frayed. "Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. I wasn't trying to—" Eastwood raised a hand. "No need." His tone was firm, but not unkind. "What's done is done. But there's a lesson here, if you'll hear it." The businessman nodded. Desperate, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Eastwood cradled his coffee cup, eyes distant. "People think respect is transactional, that you give it based on titles, fame, what someone can do for you." He turned back, pinning the younger man with a look. "But real respect? That's not about them. It's about you." The words struck like a hammer. "It's not conditional," Eastwood continued. "Not about clothes or status, or whether you recognize a name. It's how you treat people, especially when you think it doesn't matter." The businessman's throat tightened. He'd built his identity on being a self-made titan, yet here, humbled by a man in a worn jacket, He faced the ugliest truth. He'd confused success with character. Eastwood took a slow sip. I've seen a lifetime of snap judgments, folks thinking they've got someone figured out at a glance. A wry shake of his head. But those assumptions, they don't define the person you're judging. They define you. The businessman stared at his hands. I'm not saying this to shame you, Eastwood said, softer now. I'm saying it because I hope next time you're about to dismiss someone, you'll remember this moment. Silence. Outside, the window clouds drifted, indifferent. The businessman's mind raced. To the colleagues he'd belittled, the strangers he'd brushed aside, the unspoken hierarchy he'd clung to like gospel. Eastwood leaned back, his message delivered. The cabin remained still, the weight of the lesson settling over them all. Somewhere over the Arizona desert, a man who'd spent his life climbing ladders realized he'd never once looked down and seen the ground crumbling beneath him. How many opportunities had he missed to connect, to truly see people because of his own arrogance? As the flight droned on, the businessman sat motionless, Eastwood's words carving canyons through his carefully constructed self-image. The cabin chatter faded into white noise, drowned out by the roaring introspection in his mind. Respect isn't about who the other person is. It's about who you are. He stole another glance at Eastwood. The man gazed serenely out the window, his profile etched with the quiet wisdom of someone who'd long since outgrown the need for validation. There was no gloating in his posture, no lingering resentment, just the peaceful demeanor of a man who'd said his piece and let go. The realization hit like a sucker punch. This wasn't humiliation. It was mercy. Suddenly, memories flooded in, ugly, unbidden, the intern whose brilliant idea he'd mocked, only to watch it become company policy, credited to his rival. The janitor he'd walked past for years, until the day the man knelt to help gather his scattered contracts, countless faces blurred by his own dismissiveness, colleagues, strangers, even friends deemed unimportant. His chest tightened. He'd built his identity on trophies, corner offices, six-figure bonuses, the deference his Rolex commanded. But Eastwood's quiet authority required none of that. The man's presence alone, unadorned, uncompromising, had dismantled him without raising a voice. A childhood memory surfaced unexpectedly, his father's calloused hands adjusting his little league cap as he muttered, "Boy, how you treat people who can't advance your career. That's your true resume." Back then he'd rolled his eyes. Now the words burned. Around him, passengers stole reverent glances at Eastwood. Not the starstruck gawking he'd seen at celebrity galas, but something deeper. Recognition, not just of fame, but of a life, lived without pretense. The businessman looked down. His knuckles were bone white on the armrests, his tailored sleeves wrinkled from tension. With effort, he unclenched his hands. Who am I without the job title, the suit, the illusion of control? Outside, the LA skyline glittered, a kingdom where he'd always felt like royalty. Today, it looked different, smaller. As the wheels touched down, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just a flight. It was a fork in the road, one path, littered with the hollow trophies of his ego, the other. He didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time in years, he was willing to ask the questions. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Eastwood stood, collecting his worn bag with the ease of a man who traveled light in every sense. As he stepped into the aisle, he paused, just for a heartbeat, and met the businessman's gaze. No words. Just a nod. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. A challenge. Then he was gone, melting into the deboarding crowd like just another passenger. The businessman remained seated, staring at the empty space where a legend had stood. On the seatback screen, the flight map still glowed. Arrived. He took a shuddering breath and began for the first time to unpack his baggage. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, a perfect landing. For the businessman, it felt like the end of one journey and the start of another. As the cabin erupted into the usual post-flight rituals, seatbelts unclicking, overhead bins thudding open. He sat frozen, Eastwood's words still echoing in his bones. Respect isn't about who the other person is. It's about who you are. The truth of it hollowed him out. All those years measuring people by their LinkedIn profiles, their watch brands, their proximity to power. And the moment that mattered most had come from a man in worn loafers who didn't need to prove a damn thing. Then Eastwood stood. The businessman's breath hitched as the legend paused beside his seat. When their eyes met, he braced for scorn, but instead saw something worse, understanding. "Take care of yourself," Eastwood said so quietly only he could hear. 3 words that somehow carried the weight of a lifetime. Then he was gone, melting into the deboarding crowd like smoke. The terminal's fluorescent lights stung the businessman's eyes as he trudged toward baggage claim. Around him, travelers rushed toward their routines, but his usual urgency was gone. His phone buzzed. A client email marked urgent. For once, he ignored it. Instead, he opened a new note and typed, "Be like Eastwood, not the fame, not the films, but the way of him." That quiet certainty, the refusal to be diminished by small minds, the courage to call out a stranger's cruelty without raising his voice. Outside, LA sunlight poured over him like an absolution. He inhaled, really inhaled, for the first time in years. Somewhere between Phoenix and here, he'd shed an old skin. The weight of his Rolex felt suddenly absurd on his wrist. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew this. Respect would no longer be a currency he spent selectively. Humility wouldn't shame him, it would free him. And the next time he saw someone who didn't belong in first class, he'd remember the man who owned the room without saying a word.